I'm Patrick Watson, I'm an astrologer, and you're watching 12 different types of Aries Rising. And so now we're going to be looking at Aries Rising with Mars and Leo in the 5th house. So let's take a look at what the 5th house is about. I call it the 5th house of creation. The 5th house is typically associated with sex, fertility, children, pleasure, fun, recreation, entertainment. It's a very pleasant house. And we get this notion of how the 5th house is kind of a pleasant house from a few sources. And number one, it's a nocturnal benefic house, so it's the joy of Venus, and so the 5th gets these sort of more Venus-y attributes like romantic unions and sex and then fun, recreation, pleasure, parties, that kind of thing. But the 5th house also represents children. Obviously, children coming from sex. That's how you get children, is by having sex. At least if it happens between two people who can. Yeah, okay, never mind. All right, you get it. I think you understand that. All right, so the 5th house follows the 4th house. The 5th house, whatever sign is in the 5th house, will eventually settle down at the 4th sign. It'll eventually become the 4th sign. So it represents kind of what comes after one's origins. Because the third house is like siblings and cousins and stuff, sort of parallel to your origins, whereas, the 4th house is your origins, parents, grandparents, ancestors. But the 5th is kind of what comes after. And so obviously what comes after your generation is, your kids, or the kids who are, your next generation. And so there's something, very hopeful about, the next generation. They always, children and the next generation of young people always represent, kind of a, potential new chance to kind of, get things right. And, there's hope in that, in their creation and in their existence through their creative expression, that they'll be able to, do things that we couldn't. So I think there's a lot of hope associated with the 5th house. I think there's a lot of excitement associated with the 5th house, and it's a fun place, and we can see this by the planets moving away from the 4th house by zodiacal motion, but diurnal motion kind of brings them back. So it's sort of it's what eventually kind of makes the 5th house relevant for the following generations of your generation. So it doesn't also also, I think when we talk about children, it doesn't always mean like literal children. It can also be like your metaphorical children, your creations, or people you mentor, or things like that. It can also mean adolescents, not just children, youth. So with Aries rising with Mars and Leo, with Aries rising with Mars and Leo 5th house, I would call this position the gladiator, the diva, and the showman. So this would be someone who is characterized by youthful, prideful, creative expression, rugged individualism, and aggressive confidence, ceding the spotlight to no one, not even the next generation. And this is the most common sign for Mars to be in, and thus this is the most common ascendant ruler for Aries risings. Not by much, but, still some amount. So let's take a look at some real-world examples of how this might turn out. So Bette Midler, she's a singer. She's a brassy showbiz diva. She was born with Aries rising with Mars and Leo 5th, and she's this popular performer, singer, actress. She's very loud, brash, kind of old school, vivacious. It's brassy, bawdy, Broadway diva persona, very Leo-like, because Leo is a sign of lights, and the 5th is this, place of entertainment. And what's interesting is that she came to prominence when she began singing in local gay bathhouses, and she became known as Bathhouse Betty. This is really the stepping stone that led to her having this big career, was by singing at these places where sex was taking place. And she even had this name, which is very suggestive, of, this this kind of scandalous place in some ways. But I just think it's interesting because the fifth house, is relates to sex and relates to entertainment, and these are two topics that are relevant in her individual rise to fame. So a long career in music, Broadway, movies followed. What I think is interesting is that to many young people, most young people, who didn't see like her whole career, they may associate her primarily with Winifred the Witch from the children's movie Hocus Pocus. So it's funny that to children, she is this like dramatic witch character, with the ridiculous hair. And she dresses up as Winifred, each Halloween, because this movie Hocus Pocus has become kind of a cult hit, and so I think it's just a funny way that she has sort of connected with with future generations. They don't really know like the whole breadth of her work or anything, but they appreciate this kind of Marsy, witchy character she played for this movie. She also inexplicably wrote a children's book called The Saga of Baby Divine. She never wrote any other children's books after that, but it's just kind of interesting that she just randomly decided to do that. I'm not sure why she would have done that, but it clearly was important to her. Otherwise, she wouldn't have done it. And we just have to consider that her ascendant ruler Mars is in the fifth house, and for whatever reason, children would be this important topic. So something else kind of interesting is she wrote a rather having children, she described it was a major point of conflict in her relationships and a major reason she decided to no longer fight with her husband. They decided to basically put away all of their arguments, in order to be the best parents they could be to her child. And what's interesting is that despite her kind of freewheeling stage persona, she's a down a birth with Sun in the ninth, in Sagittarius, which I think is another part of the Brassy showstopper, showbiz kind of thing. So yeah, despite her kind of larger-than-life stage persona, she's actually very strict with her daughter Sophie, and for some reason it says Sophia, and that's just a freaking typo that I can't erase. It's just there forever now. So her daughter claimed the only thing her mother allowed her to watch were silent movies and musicals. So interestingly, she was a very kind of hardcore mother. Even though she, had this kind of more, even though she wasn't like that in public. There we go. I can't even speak. Okay. Let's take a look at another example. Jack Valenti. He's this Washington, Hollywood power player. He was born with Aries Rising with Mars in Leo 5th, conjunct Neptune in Leo, co-present with Venus in Leo. And a major focus of his life was on entertainment, recreation, children, lights, stars, and leaders. He was a bomber pilot in World War II, which I guess kind of sufficed for the Mars part of the equation. But he also created advertising. He created an advertising agency, and he managed advertising for presidential campaigns. So he kind of became like spokespeople, point people for these big, powerful leaders. And eventually he became the special assistant to President Lyndon Johnson. And then, after that, he became head of the Motion Picture Association of America. So this is a guy who's been kind of in the room with, the most powerful people in showbiz, Hollywood, as well as in Washington, D.C., in politics. When he became head of the Motion Picture Association of America, he established a rating system that was deliberately designed to inform parents about violence and sexual content before showing their children. And so I just think it's interesting because, it's conjunct Neptune, which is associated with cinema, but also, the fifth house has to do with children, and it has to do with, it has this concern. The Mars in the fifth, as his ascendant ruler, has this concern or activity, concerning children. He was known as a fierce lobbyist for the entertainment industry and how for copyright infringements. So that's again kind of that Mars coming through. He's he was kind of a cop for the showbiz world, and we don't know what his relationships were like with his own children. He did seem to express guilt about being absent, but we don't really know what he was like with his kids. So his autobiography was titled "This Time, This Place: My Life in the War, the White House, and Hollywood." And I just think that's a perfect distillation of like the various themes of his Mars placement, the fact that it's in Leo, and his life in war, Mars, the White House, and Hollywood, Leo. So I thought it was a kind of a good example. James Dean, he's a rebel teen icon, born with Aries Rising with Mars on the 5th. We might also notice that he was born with Uranus Rising on the Ascendant as well. I'll have a bit more to say about that later. But essentially, he was remembered as this cultural icon of teenage disillusionment and social estrangement, as expressed in the title of his most celebrated film, Rebel Without a Cause. And I mean, that's very Marsy. And remember, the 5th house is not just children, but like youth, adolescence. And so, the time period that he grew up in, this is like when the concept of the teenager was being born. The kind of post-World War II financially empowered young people kind of created this new class of people called teenagers. Right before the rock and roll era kind of hit, which is interesting because a lot of people kind of say that James Dean is this sort of rock and roll icon, even though, there was no rock and roll music in any of his movies. He just kind of had the feel of rock and roll. And so that's kind of interesting because he died in a car crash on September 30th, 1955. And that was when Uranus was conjunct his natal Mars. And that was when Uranus had recently ingressed into Leo, and that's when like Elvis Presley came along, and when rock and roll was this really disruptive force in music and in culture at large in the West. And so that gives you all of these different connotations of like youth and adolescence and kind of the excitement and unlimited potential of like a new generation is sort of all there, and James Dean kind of became its sort of spiritual leader or totem, for this new age of rock and roll. And he also had a kind of a rock and roll life as well in his short life. He was a very daring risk taker in areas of leisure. He was into fast cars, obviously. And he was very sexually adventurous, which is, neither here nor there, but, the 5th is about sex, so sort of something we have to kind of expect. So, I think it describes the way he kind of acted in his life, but also this kind of broader role that he took on as this kind of symbolic figure for the rock and roll new age, as it were. I have a couple more examples that just highlight how someone's ascendant ruler can actually revolve around children when it's in the 5th. Georges Moricand is a pediatrician. He was born in 1880, but we actually have an AA-rated time for him. And he's born with Aries Rising with Mars on the 5th, and he was a prominent pediatrician in France, which means he was a doctor for children. He conducted decades of research on dietary needs of children and illnesses affecting children, and he even conducted research on the effect of weather upon the behavior of newborns, which I don't know what that means. Was he like holding babies out in the cold or something? I don't know. But he was also head of pediatrics at a hospital, and interestingly, he also carried out a lot of his research in collaboration with his own daughter, Dr. Violette Edel. So, he was studying children, and he even studied children with his children. I mean, this is a guy who, definitely must have had something to do with children in his chart, and he does. He has, Mars and Leo ruling the ascendant in the 5th house. So this topic of children was a large focus of his life. And a final example, Wilhelm Strohmeyer is a child psychiatrist. We don't know anything about him. He was born in 1874, Aries Rising with Mars on the 5th. All we know is that he's the first child psychiatrist in Germany. And so I just thought it was an interesting example to include along with the pediatrician example. So there you have it. Those are some real-world examples of how having Mars and Leo in the 5th can turn out for you. Next, we'll be looking at Mars in Virgo in the 6th with Aries Rising.